Hi, I'm Clay Thomas, and I'm here to present exponential communication separations between notions of selfishness. And this is joint work with Aviad Rubinstein, Raghavansh Saxena, Matt Weinberg, and Junyao Zhao. So the setting of this paper is this general algorithmic mechanism design setting, where we're interested in computing some function f of t1 through tn, where the type ti is known only to some player I. And our goal is to find a communication protocol minimizing the communication cost between us and the players. But the mechanism design twist is that player I must be incentivized to follow the protocol. They won't just do it because you asked them to. Indeed, Ti is player I's type, which determines their utility UI TIA when outcome A is selected. And players only care about this utility, and they could care less about helping you to implement your favorite social choice function f. For a very simple example, Ti could represent how much player I values m different items, and f is going to pick some good matching of the players to the items. And of course, the players could care less about the matching as a whole, they only care about the items they have. So a super high level overview of this paper, the type of thing we're interested in is these three different quantities. First, the communication complexity to compute f without any regard to incentives. And second, the communication required to weakly incentivize f. And third, to strongly incentivize f. Don't worry exactly what those mean so far, but we're interested in the relationship between those three quantities. Trivially, we have A is less than B is less than C, and the main result of our paper is actually exponential separations between all three of these quantities, which is as large as they can be. So no details so far. Let's illustrate exactly what we're talking about through a very simple example. Let's say there's an environment with n players and a single indivisible item that I can award to a single player. So the types of each players are simply numbers ti greater than 0, which represent how much each player values receiving the item. And the function is to simply award the item to the player with the highest value ti. So if this is our goal, consider here's a protocol to implement the goal. This is just a simple communication protocol that asks each bidder what their value is and then outputs the outcome that awards the item to the highest bidder. And this actually does not incentivize the bidders to tell the truth because I haven't charged any prices so far or anything like that. And if I want the item at all, I might as well just bid some super high value and try to get the item. So mechanisms in most settings must charge prices to incentivize any type of good behavior. And specifically in this environment, if I wins the item but is charged a price P, then their total value will be Ti minus P. And if they don't win the item, they won't be charged anything and they'll just walk away with value 0. So now let's consider protocol 2, which works in the same way as protocol 1, but charges the winner a price equal to the second highest Ti that was announced. And indeed, you can check pretty easily that if other players bid T2 through Tn, it's always in player 1's best interest to bid T1. That will maximize their utility. But let's be a little more specific about this protocol 2, what exactly is going on. And let's say it happens with all agents standing in this public hall, and they walk up in order 1 to up to n, and publicly announce their Ti to everyone. And we'll charge the same prices and do the allocation the same way as before. In this case, here's a strategy that the second player could do. If player 1 bids 10, player 2 would bid 9 in response to that. And for any other thing that player 1 would announce as their bid, player 2 is going to bid 0. This is some well-defined strategy in this public information game. Against this strategy, truth-telling is not in player 1's best interest. If their true value is 10, they'd rather bid 5 and get the item for free. But of course, there's a very easy way to fix this without affecting its communication complexity at all. what's called a sealed bid auction, where each of the agents simultaneously and privately submit their bid, and we don't tell anybody else's bid. Here you can easily see that truth-telling is a best response regardless of what strategy the other players are playing, because a strategy can only correspond to a single number. So one thing to just highlight and observe now is that unlike when we're talking about communication complexity for non-strategic agents, we have to consider what happens when agents break the protocol and act in a way that's inconsistent with any type. So now that we've seen this example, we can do our formal definitions. So consider a mechanism M and S1 through Sn, where SI-TI denotes the strategy that player I is meant to use when their type is TI. So SI-TI tells player I how to play. The weak type of incentivizing the function is with an ex post incentive compatible mechanism, an epic mechanism. And formally, this is just that for all types that the other players could possibly have, if other players are playing S minus I, T minus I, then the best strategy I can play is SI-TI. And some fancy notation was used here just to signal that your final utility is the utility for the outcome minus any price that you're charged. So one example of this is protocol 2 from the previous slides. The stronger definition of incentive compatibility is dominant strategy incentive compatibility. And this weakens the assumption that other players are playing consistent with some S minus I, T minus I. Instead, we want it to be in player I's best interest to play SI-TI, regardless of what strategy other people are doing. And protocol 3, the sealed bid auction, fixed this issue in protocol 2. And for protocol 3, every strategy made it so that I would want to tell the truth. And our formal results, we can now state this as well. First, there exists a function f with communication complexity C, but such that any epic mechanism for f has exponential communication. And our second separation for the stronger notion of DSIC is there exists a different function G such that there exists an epic mechanism with communication C, but any DSIC mechanism requires communication exponential in C. Both separations turn out to be as large as possible. I won't get into why right now. And they're also optimal in the number of players. You can't have these separations for just one player, and both of our constructions witnessing these separations are for just 2 players. All right, so now let's look in more detail about this first separation between CC and CC epic. First, some remarks. So define CC epic as the minimum communication cost of an epic mechanism for F. So the gap between CC and CC epic is not super hard to describe. It's essentially just the communication required to compute the payments that the mechanism has to use. So some prior work has studied this. Fidel and Segal in 2009 originally posed to study the relationship between these 2 quantities, and they demonstrated this worst case upper bound of CC epic is at most exponential in CC. And moreover, they showed it could be strictly larger than CC. They gave an instance where you needed at least 1 more bit. So some progress towards this was made by Babayoff, Blumrose, and Shapira in 2013. And they gave an F with n players such that CC epic was at least n times CC. So linear in the number of players, but this didn't give you very much for 2 players, and it was still very far from the worst case exponential upper bound. That was all we had. And various other papers studied weaker notions than epic. For example, mechanisms that are allowed to allocate items randomly and are allowed to assume that players only care about their expected payoff, but we won't talk much about that. And interestingly, the time seemed to be ripe for progress on this old open problem to be made, because also in STOC there is another paper by Dobzhinsky and Ron that gives the same separation we do. So if you find this interesting, definitely check out their paper as well. I'm also going to give a super sketchy and high level overview of how our construction works. So there are m items 1 through m, and Alice has a really small type. And depending on this type, Alice will either get item I or I plus 1. And she knows that just from looking at her own type. So if Alice would just send her type to Bob, Bob can say which item she gets using only 1 bit. And this already, with this setup, we know that CC is small. So let's think about CC epic if we have to incentivize this thing. So what we do there is to give Bob a very large type that can affect what Alice gets. And moreover, it can affect what Alice gets for every I plus 1 pair. And we use this dependence on the type of Bob to carefully control the prices. Specifically, we carefully control the difference in the price of item I and the price of item I plus 1. I won't say exactly how this works, but one trick that we use is that certain types of Alice have very close to the same value for all items, and yet depending on Bob's type, they might get different outcomes or they might get the same outcomes. That trick alone places a very high exacting constraint on the prices we need. And as a result of this construction, each type of Bob induces a distinct price that the mechanism must sometimes charge for certain Alice types. And because the mechanism needs so many different prices, one for each of Bob's huge type, you need exponentially large communication even to describe the prices. And CC epic is exponential in the communication complexity. See the paper for details. Thankfully, our construction is very concise and elegant, at least in our opinion. I'm going to talk a bit more about our second separation between CC epic and CC DSIC. So first, some remarks. Define CC DSIC as the minimum communication complexity of a DSIC mechanism. And the gap between CC epic and CC DSIC is a little more subtle. It's less easy to describe in this clean way compared to the prices characterization in the previous section. In particular, when thinking about DSIC mechanisms, we have to keep track of exactly what the players know about the types of the other players. And we have to think about players that are acting inconsistently with what we want them to do, just like in this protocol 2 from the introductory examples. So there was a little less prior work on this direction, actually. In 2016, Dobzhinsky proved that in some specific auction-like environments, you can convert any epic mechanism to a DSIC mechanism with a low communication overhead. But other than that, not much else is known. And in particular, we had to invent some pretty new techniques that applied this DSIC constraint at every node of the game tree of this game that the players are playing. So we won't get too deep into the proof, but let's spend some time describing how we made the construction, building up to our construction. So recall protocol 2 from the introduction. This was the example that was epic, but not DSIC. And this had player 1 publicly announce T1, and then player 2 sees it, reacts, and announces T2. So a first idea is just to simply modify the environment so that there's a reason to tell player 2 about player 1's type. There was no real reason in the auction before. We could have just had them do it sealed bid. But now let's think, how can reacting to player 1's type help us save a whole lot on communication? And here's one way to do it. Alice wants a single set S of half of the items. Now we're in a mini item auction. And Bob's type will decide whether Alice gets S or S bar. Let's say whichever one Bob wants less. The exact details don't matter. But the key intuition is that this is sort of an indexing problem into Bob's type. Alice just wants this single S. This is like an index into Bob's very large type, where he's okay with either of S or S bar for each tuple S bar of size m over 2. So this indexing problem can help us save a lot on communication if Alice announces her type publicly. So let's indeed consider that mechanism M1. So Alice announces her type, Bob sees it, and Bob sends a single bit to determine which is S or S bar. This turns out not to be DSIC because Bob might respond and sort of adversarially give Alice the worst of her sets. So when Alice says S, Bob will say S bar, and when Alice says S, Bob might say, and when Alice says S bar, Bob might say S. So without telling Bob anything, he'd need to communicate his entire exponentially large type. This is why we might think at first that this witnesses a communication separation between CC epic and CC DSIC. Unfortunately, it does not end up witnessing that separation. So let's look at a DSIC mechanism for it. In the same auction from before, just have Alice publicly announce the tuple S bar without saying which is which. She doesn't tell anyone, she doesn't tell the mechanism designer. And now this new mechanism is DSIC for this problem. If Alice deviates to some other tuple S bar, she gets zero utility just by definition. And in particular, Bob can't condition on the difference between S and S bar. So this mechanism ends up being DSIC. So what ends up working and witnessing the separation we want is actually to consider two disjoint copies of this auction. There's two more or less independent sets of items, and Alice wants one set from each of them. And her valuation is additive. So this function witnesses our separation. And again, we won't go too deep into the proof, but here's one little thought experiment you can use to think about why this might start to be hard. Try to implement the trick that we used to make a DSIC mechanism before, when there was only one set of items. This trick of having Alice hide information. Well, now Bob can react to way more than just the difference between S and S bar. Now he can react to Alice's report on the first set of items, and he can condition what he'll give Alice on the second set of items based on what Alice says about the first set of items. So in order to implement the trick from before, we would need to not only hide Alice's distinction between S and S bar, but her entire valuation on the second set of items. She would have to obscure that entire information to make this trick work. And then we would be back in the situation from before where Bob has to send his exponentially large type in order to implement it. And in the end, it is impossible to implement this with low communication with a DSIC mechanism. All right, now I'm going to just wrap up. So one thing I want to mention is that the direction of this paper is actually not very common in algorithmic mechanism design. Typically, we have the environment and we have something we want to do in the environment, maximize the welfare or the revenue or something like that. And we want to find a communication efficient protocol that's incentivizable by some definition. And in our work, we fixed F and we said we will not compromise, we have to implement F. F is incentivizable, but now what communication is needed under different definitions of incentivizable? And this new viewpoint highlights some interesting new problems and gives some interesting insights that you might miss if you just thought in the more common framework. In particular, our insights here is that the burden of computing payments can be very high, and the burden of strong or DSIC incentivization can be very high. The second result we also find very technically interesting because it's this brand new type of communication lower bound where, again, these incentive constraints are really kind of everywhere in the game tree and not just applied to the outcome function. I also want to talk about one very high level sort of conceptual link with obviously strategy proof mechanisms. It's been a hot topic lately in the econ CS community. And one way to define OSP mechanisms very briefly is that they remain strategy proof even if you believe every other player is conspiring against you. And when you tell the truth, they'll reply with the worst possible strategies for your type. But if a DSIC mechanism must be interactive, there actually is a way for other players to conspire against you. At least intuitively there should be. Because it must be interactive. Player 2 must respond to some information that player 1 has, and if the game is sufficiently rich or something, player 2 should always be able to just abandon all of his utility and try to do the worst possible thing for some type of player 1. Of course, we just saw an example a few slides ago where this wasn't the case, and we did have a communication efficient DSIC mechanism. But intuitively and extrapolating to richer settings, we think it might be the case that interactive DSIC mechanisms are too strong to hope for in most settings we'd be interested in. But of course, this will be left for future work to do. A characterization might be very delicate, but we think something like that would be very interesting. So, thank you.